And you know what happened to his subsidies, don't you?" said the bloke who bought Egger Lodge. I was hoping the conversation wouldn't go this way. The bloke was going to talk about Brexit, and Joss wasn't going to have it. Joss was like that, very stubborn once he'd made his mind up. There was a pause while Joss tried to come up with something else that might have happened to Trevor Crigg's subsidies. "He voted to leave! That's what happened," said the bloke who bought Egger Lodge. "That's where his subsidies went, and that's why he's still having such a problem." "I'd bloody anything on Brexit, you lot will," murmured Dickon. He'd been quiet as usual, letting Joss run his mouth with possibles and reckonings. Now Joss had started floundering, Dickon had stepped in as backup. The bloke laughed, one of those little barky laughs that are the opposite of finding something funny. "And, sorry, what exactly do you mean by my lot?" he said. "Do you mean—" I stopped listening because Trudy was saying the barrel was out, and did I want to wait for her to change it? I said Amstel was fine. Joss wouldn't notice either way. Trudy moved to the Amstel pump, which was half hidden behind a stack of cheap, unglazed crockery. Jeff had got it as a job lot from Duggan and Renier, and there was more than the pub could use, so it was now on sale. 1p an item. God knows what Jeff thought the point of that was. I tapped to pay and carried everything back to the table. The bloke was still going on about what Dickon presumed his lot were. Lefty, Guardian reading, Ramoning, espresso drinking, something. Joss was smirking, about to jump in at any second and say something to wind the bloke up. Dickon was just looking at him. He probably needed another couple of pints in him to start a proper row, but it was coming, like a storm wind swirling in a wood. I gasped as I set the drinks down on the table, like I'd had to run up the street for them. I fussily passed them around to break up the conversation. Hobgoblin for Dickon, Amstel for Joss, G&T for the bloke, and I had a half-lime soda since I was driving home. Joss and the bloke looked a bit put out, as if I'd stopped the fun. Dickon at least knew I'd meant to. He and I had talked about it enough since the vote, and he knew I'd gone soft. When you're going around doing regular pest control for the area, you end up watching how folks live, what's on the up, what's on the down. Everything was on the down. If it wasn't EU agricultural subsidies, it was export problems or shortage of labour, or a bit of everything. It had turned out like abandoning ship for the freedom to swim in the ocean, and nobody helped. We'd just been left to deal with it. I hadn't expected the blokes lefty city lot to deal with it. They'd not voted for it after all, but the actual leavers, we thought they had a plan, and they didn't. The plan was to keep talking about how it was better. Dickon knew this was bollocks, really, but he'd always believed in survival of the fittest. If you couldn't adapt, you die, and that was your own silly fault. "Did you talk to Eric about picking?" Dickon said to Joss. "He'd tell me you go £15 an hour if you ask." Joss stared into the head of his Amstel. "Nah, fuck that. Not for me." "Really, who is it for then?" said the bloke who'd bought Egger Lodge. "Well, it's them," said Joss, realising he was about to say foreigners and where that would lead. The bloke made a face and shrugged his shoulders. He didn't seem the type to start fights. It was probably just the stress of moving into the lodge and then the wasp nest I'd had to sort out for him. He wasn't making a great impression, though, and since I was the one who'd introduced everyone, I needed to be the one building bridges. "You settled in pretty well, looks like," I said chirpily. "Nice to have someone in the lodge again. Always felt a bit sad when you come to Egger Marsh and the first thing you see is this place all boarded up. Be good, that." "Just happy to help out," said the bloke, already mellowing a bit. Dickon leaned back on his stool against the wall. "Course you know why it'd been empty, right?" he said. The bloke looked at me and Joss like this was a secret we were both in on, but both our faces were blank. We neither of us had any idea. I don't know whether he believed us. The bloke smirked a little bit like it was payback for being right about Brexit, which he was happy to take on the chin. "Go on," he said to Dickon, in a gentle dare. Dickon wetted his mouth with his pint. "So you at the lodge, yeah? And you done your research, so you know about Egger Marsh House, the big house. Used to be up in the woods behind." "Yes, and it burned down in the 70s, said the bloke. Right. Done your work. Good boy. And you seen them bits of wall used to run round the edge of the estate, all mossy and tumble down? Well, that ain't just age. That's 'cause it's right up against the Egger Marsh. Every time it get built up, it starts slipping back into the bog. Well, it were 1840 or thereabout, and the gent what owned Egger Marsh House had a daughter, and she fall in love with the son of the keeper at Egger Lodge. This fella can't be having his daughter going about with a common lad, so they have a blazing row, and the daughter's that angry she storms out into the chucking rain to find her lad. Run away with him, maybe. Next morning, though, they check the lodge, and she never turned up. Search the old village, still nothing. Even send someone up Lockham to the railway station, nothing. Few days this go on, till this peddler that were passing the house says how he seen the daughter cutting through a gap in the wall to go straight to the lodge, across the Egger Marsh. Now, it's a little bit tricky today, you'll get your car stuck in it, but back in them days after a downpour, well, like the Great Grimpen Mire, said the bloke, glancing again at me and Joss. Right, very nasty. So they out there with planks and poles and whatnot, lying on them, poking, trying to find her. Nearly lose a lad into the bog too. And one of them, he sees this lock of blonde hair coming out the ground, like a will-o'-the-wisp. When they get there, they see what's happened. Dickon supped again. Poor gal, she'd stepped into one of the deepest bits of the marsh, straight down into a pocket of mud that closed up around her right up to her eyes, nose and mouth full of bog and her too stuck to move. But that's not the worst of it. We were silent. Dickon spread his hands in front of him, touching his thumb and index fingertips together. So remember they found her because of this one wisp of hair? Well, that were the only bit of hair she had left. All the skin on top of her head poking out from the bog. Eaten. Nibbled up by crows, foxes, hedgehogs, till just a white shining skull were left. Eyes gone too, gobbled out of her head. But she drowned, didn't she? She drowned before that, Joss stammered. Well, you hope so, Dickon replied. This hung in the air, then he continued. Anyway, they gets her out, buries her, tries to move on from it. But they says that if you're out on the Egger Marsh after dark, in the rain, chance you'll see her head in the mud. Looked like a white shiny rock at first, but every day it's moving, slowly getting closer and closer to the lodge. And when she gets there, she'll climb out to find her young man. Call her the Maid of the Marsh, they do. Dickon waited a couple of seconds, then stood and strode into the gents. The ice had melted in the bloke's G&T, and he fumbled his phone out of a pocket to check the time. Shouldn't stay out too late. Got the old GP check-up tomorrow, he said unconvincingly. Fair play, mate, said Joss, who was swaying slightly on his stool. A few minutes later the bloke had paid a friendly farewell to Dickon and left. Joss and I stared at him, each on the verge of asking where the hell he'd heard that story from, when Dickon grinned a roly-stained grin and cackled with laughter. By closing time I was already at home. Dickon and Joss phoned me to pick them up from the pub. They could have asked anyone, but insisted through waves of giggles that it had to be me. They both got in the back, reeking of beer. Joss was holding a plastic bag containing some of the remaining bits of crockery from the bar. They clattered and scraped against each other like shattered bones. I drove not to Egger Lodge but past it, so they could walk back. Sharp flakes of cheap broken porcelain on the back seat. I knew what they were doing, and I should have driven off then, but I still had to live here. I didn't want to get Dickon's back up. I waited like a nervous parent until they came back. No bag, coated in mud, sopping wet but sniggering like happy babies. Wash out, boy. Maid of the Marsh out tonight, Joss chortled. A day or two later, the bloke who'd bought Egger Lodge was dead. Found face down at the edge of his garden, something in his heart or his brain having given way. Nobody ever mentioned anything found in the earth. No reason they would have done. Dickon, the total shit, went to the inquest and insisted on telling us about it. That's when I stopped speaking to him. I didn't see either of them again until Joss's funeral. He'd been driving into Lockham about a job after a quick pint to settle his nerves. Then he'd lost control on the dual carriageway, flipped, and caught fire. In the coffin, his suit was laid on the ashes. I had a dream about flames flickering through a howling, upside-down skull, wondered if his death was quick, and, as Dickon might have said, hoped it was. According to Trudy, Dickon stopped going to the pub. He couldn't be the pensive, quiet bloke by himself. It just made him fade. He started acting up to get attention, and Jeff had had a word. Dickon didn't like folks having words with him. It was several weeks later, when he'd missed a few appointments and bill payments, that anyone thought to check on him. A postman had seen him working on his septic tank, and later that day the same postman saw the tank was closed and Dickon was gone. He'd climbed inside for some reason to fix a blockage or fish out his phone, and the door had somehow shut and got stuck. All that time later, Dickon's body was too bloated to fit through the hatchway, and they had to puncture him like an old football. Like a total shit, I went to his inquest, as he'd have wanted. I don't believe we put a curse on ourselves because of what we did to the bloke who bought Egger Lodge. Although I am doing unsettling things. I cannot for the life of me remember that bloke's name, or whether I've locked everything up last thing at night. I do work with a lot of poisons, and maybe some of them are leaking. Well, you hope so.